So now for something completely different. And Bob set me up very well to give you a talk today to introduce you to myself and introduce you to something about neuroscience, introduce you to inside my brain for a few minutes today. And I like this dichotomy that Bob started to introduce. And to introduce myself, well, I grew up watching Star Trek, and I wanted to be Captain Kirk or Spock or something. I wanted to explore. And when I grew up and went to college, you know, it wasn't an option to be on the Starship Enterprise. And so, you know, I looked around me and I could be an explorer of the mind. And this is really, when I talk to my students, it really is exciting. I spend about half my time doing research and half my time with patients. And sometimes I use the term, I feel like a detective when I'm talking with my patients. I'm trying to figure out what brought them to this place in front of me. And I also feel like an explorer when I'm working with data and with researcher. It's a mystery. It's where are we going to be at the end of the day. It's exciting to be able to look at these problems of the brain and the mind and how behavior works. So I ended up being an explorer, and here be dragons if when the explorers got to the edge of the world in the olden days, and I'll introduce you to this concept, they thought there were dragons at the edge of the world. So when you really get far on the edge of your exploration, there might be dragons there at the end of the day. So that's where the here be dragons comes from. So the organization of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about what is creativity. It's not just one thing, it's many things, and I want to kind of walk you through that. I want to talk to you about the evolution of creativity, and I'll come back to this dichotomy, this back and forth between two different things about what's going on in the mind, or what different reasoning processes I think is involved in creative cognition versus reasoning in general. And then where is it? That's the big question. Where is it in the brain? What's going on with creative cognition that might be different from intellectual capacity? But first, just to reinforce this dichotomy, you know, there's two types of people in the world, and just to loosen you up a little bit, there's those who believe in two types of people and those who don't, right? Yeah, so there's those who you drink with and those that make you want to drink. Just to kind of get you into the spirit of things. There's those who can extrapolate from incomplete data. All right, and now you're with me, good. And this last one is from Louis C.K. I've cleaned it up a little bit. There's those who pee in the shower, and there's dirty, rotten liars. All right, so there's two types of people in the world, and you know, this is kind of a theme that runs through my talk that you'll see. Now, I also want to talk about wicked problems, and the wicked problem that I want to introduce you to is this one. Now, I'll get my mic as close as I can.
Well, the big chainsaw is now on the porch, but it froze up. So we're down to the little saw for right now.
Oh. So it's snowing. It's got the chainsaw. It's going to cut down this tree. It could work. Chainsaw stopped. It started up again. They're filming him. The family's filming him, of course, out in a driving snowstorm. He doesn't realize it yet that it's a wicked problem that he's trying to solve.
Here it goes, and it's going the wrong way.
Oh, yeah. And it's down. Okay, so
Well, I don't think I got that, but that was not good at all.
people are running around. Okay, so he didn't realize he was solving a wicked problem when he first got into this problem. There's no definitive formulation of a wicked problem. Wicked problems have no stopping rule. Once you get into them, there's a no stopping rule. Solutions to wicked problems are not true or false, but good or bad. That was certainly the case. There's no immediate, no ultimate test of solutions to wicked problems. They're very complicated. And the social planner has no right to be wrong in a wicked problem. So that was certainly the case in this. So sometimes when you think you're dealing with a logical, linear problem, it actually turns out to be a compounded, wicked problem. And that is certainly the case with this individual. All right, so what is creativity? It's the production of something novel and useful. And this isn't my definition, but this is a definition that comes to us from history. 1953, Morris Stein gave us this definition of creativity. And I liked, again, this dichotomy between novelty on the one hand and usefulness in the other. Just novelty is not enough. It could be the word salad of someone with schizophrenia. It could be the drawings of your child that you think are nice, they're novel, but they're not particularly useful outside of the door of your refrigerator. And utility, for utility's sake, has been done to death. So that combination of novelty and usefulness creates this dynamic tension that I think is important for the creation of something truly creative. And it's a good definition for creativity because then you have to understand what's going on in the brain, this tension in the brain between novelty and usefulness as well. And creativity is not one thing. It's not just one thing that your brain is doing, but it's many things with different stages. And this comes to us from Henri Poincaré, who is a famous mathematician, philosopher, who looked at his own thought process when he was thinking of his creative process and came up with 5 actual stages that were trimmed to 4 of the creative process: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. And I want to walk you through these in turn. Preparation is the first stage of the creative process. You have to have some raw materials in your head to be creative with. Something does not come from nothing. So while your child can make beautiful scribbled drawings, they don't have enough skill set yet to be particularly useful outside of the parent's adoration. The artist needs to understand something about color and tone and hue and usually something about the shape of the human body. There has to be some skills that emerge or are developed over time. The scientist has to understand the scientific method. A neuroscientist has to understand something about the brain. You have to have some raw materials to prepare with, and this usually is that proverbial 10-year rule that you've heard so much about, or 10,000 hours. That's an average, as Bob was talking about. Some people take quicker to get to that 10 years, some people take shorter, but it does take a period of time for people to get enough skills that they can start to put things together in novel and useful ways. Now, this is Picasso's Guernica, his magnum opus of creative achievement, but if you've seen Picasso, he created some 20,000 individual works of art, and they're not all Guernica. I went to a museum one time and I took a picture of a plate that he had done, and it looks something like something your child would do. He's trying out different ideas, and this gets to the next stage of creativity that is important: incubation. There's lots of different trials that are important in creative cognition, and you have to let these different trials work their way out. So Picasso is trying, he tried 20,000 different things. They're not all going to be masterpieces. These ideas have to percolate, they have to incubate, they have to sit for a while. And people have different, highly creative people have different techniques that they use to facilitate that incubation process. Beethoven had his long walks, the famous story of Archimedes being in the bath and discovering how to measure the amount of gold in a crown and yelling "Eureka!" There's other techniques. Hemingway liked to tipple a little bit. So, I mean, drinking and some sort of cognitive disinhibition. It's usually letting the brain rest for a while. This is an important characteristic of most of these techniques. The long walk, meditation, use of substances, which I don't recommend, but these different techniques to downregulate the ongoing activity of knowledge acquisition, so you can let things rest for a while, let ideas run into each other, are very important for the incubation process. Illumination is the next stage of creative cognition, this aha moment where an idea comes from unconscious part of the mind to the conscious cognition. I don't think it's critical to have an aha moment. Most of my creative ideas are through this long process of trial and error, and you might get closer to an idea and then it's good enough. I have had moments of insight, but I don't think that's a critical aspect of creative cognition. So I don't want to overemphasize that. But some people do describe this aha moment of insight as being important to their creative capacity. And then verification. You have to check if your creative work is going to work out in the world. Are you communicating it to the audience in such a way that they will accept it? Are you persisting over time in a way that it will get out there into the world? This verification is an important step. So preparation, incubation, illumination, verification, all of these are amenable to scientific study and are being studied by different researchers in different laboratories. So creativity is not one thing, it's many things, but we have to parse them into these different pieces so that we can study them. Now, I'm going to stretch your minds a little bit because I'm starting to think about creativity as a byproduct of a basic reasoning capacity that humans have and perhaps other species have as well through evolutionary processes. Is creativity important to human survival? Bob and I were talking about this. Is this a different reasoning capacity that evolved in our minds and in other minds as critical to our survival? And I think so. Why would creativity emerge at all? There are so many problems to solve out in the world that there's this combinatorial explosion of ideas. And I'm not going to get into all the theories that Cosmides and Tooby talk about. These are evolutionary psychologists that talk about the trade-offs between problem-solving power and specialization. There's general-purpose problem-solving architecture and special-purpose problem-solving designs. But they dichotomize, again, these problem-solving abilities into the special-purpose cognitive system and a situation-specific improvisation. If you think about the types of problems that you solve throughout your day, just to bring it down to our level a little bit, most of the problems that you solve are relatively familiar and well-known to you. They're problems that you've solved before. So you have to have this special-purpose cognitive system that is for rapid and accurate reasoning. They're problems that you recognize, they're problems that you've encountered before, they're relatively mundane problems, and you have to solve them rapidly and accurately in order to get on to what's next. This is 90+% of the problems in your day. If you think about your day, there's not a lot new that's going on. But there are a set of situation-specific things that require improvisation. When I came here on this trip, as I was about 3/4 of the way to the airport, I realized that I'd forgotten my iPhone. And I have to, survive without my iPhone. Now, that's not a big improvisation, but, we've become so dependent on our phones, it's like, am I going to be able to, check in? I had to think, it's like, well, I have my ID. Will I be able to get on the plane without my iPhone? You really have to start to think about this because it becomes so dependent on it. And I have been able to improvise so far, almost 36 hours without my iPhone. But it's required some improvisation during that period of time. And that's a less than 5%, sometimes less than 1% capacity that we have. I think that this rapid and accurate problem solving is more deductive reasoning. It's based on kind of what we think of as intelligence. It's that intelligence or IQ type of thing that we put so much stock in. It's efficient and powerful, but I think limited in application because of that. It's based on problems that are knowable. Now, the interesting thing about this system is that it's not just us that has this type of problem-solving ability, but you have dolphins. So this is Tursiops aduncus. This is a female bottlenose dolphin that's found only in Shark Bay, Australia. It's using a basket sponge to protect its beak so that it can brush against the bottom of the sandy bay and flush fish out. It's tool using, and it's very specific tool using, but this isn't just our species that's doing this type of specific reasoned problem solving. It goes across species. So this is a creative originally, but now an intelligent use of a tool. Now this is in contrast to the situation-specific improvisation, and there's another example probably my best example of situation-specific. I don't have the crayon up his nose, actually, that on the MRI, but situation-specific improvisation that Homer Simpson tends to get himself into when wicked problems emerge and he gets himself into trouble. But there's lots of situation-specific improvisation that is the source of most of the humor in The Simpsons. So again, this dichotomy, I think, is important with what's going on in the brain. We do have this rapid, accurate system that we rely on most of the time, and I think creativity emerged as this improvisational system that then the spin-off is art and music and design and things that our brain does to play with ideas. I think that is an important byproduct. So where is it in the brain? This is the $64,000 question. The answer is we don't really know, but the concept of networks helps. And this is the big new buzzword in cognitive neuroscience, that it's not just bits of pieces of brain lighting up, but it's networks within the brain that are working in tandem. And let me walk you through some of our research. First let me tell you some of the silly measures that we use to measure creativity. And that depends on what it is when we're talking about creativity. And these are some of the measures that we use, and I've talked to people last night about this measure of divergent thinking. Tell me as many different ways you can think of to use a brick. We still ask students this. We still ask people this in our laboratory. And it's to build a house, to hit my sister on the head with, as a mock coffin at a Barbie funeral. Well, the last one's a little different than the first two. Is it more creative? Is it just novel? Is it useful? And we can rate the output of these items that are very common, like a paper clip or a brick, and measure them on fluency, the number of ideas generated, the number of different ideas generated, different categories. Is it a weapon? Is it a building material? Is it a decorative item? And we can look at originality, which is what we're really interested in. Another type of measure of insight, this is how we measure insight, or that aha moment. We give people 3 words, lick, mine, and shaker, and ask them to think of one word that binds them all together into a compound word. Can you think of the one word that pulls those all together? Yes? Yeah. Salt lick, salt mine, salt shaker. And you didn't arrive at that through a process of deduction, it just sprung into your head. And most people describe that experience where it's like, well, it's lick, spittle, and mine, it's, what could that be? It appears out of seemingly nowhere, that flash of insight. So that's our measure of insight. Not particularly good, but that's how we do it in the laboratory. Another measure of creativity is this kind of puzzle where we have people remove matches to make different numbers of boxes. So remove one match to make for 7 boxes, and you can say remove S, and you'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 squares. Remove 4 matches to get 5 boxes. That one's a little harder. But you can remove H, L, Q, and H, 1, 2, 3, 4, and a big box. And people have to kind of expand the definition of a box. And you can have little boxes and you can have big boxes. And this comprises a big box and then the 4 little ones. So that kind of cognitive expansion is what you're pulling for. You can have people in an fMRI environment give you as many different new uses for a pen. And so they're thinking, you give them a prototypical pen, and then they're starting to think of new uses for a pen. You see what's going on in their brain. And then if those of you who've seen the Rorschach, you can just give them ink blots and have them describe the old Rorschach ink blot test. And so I don't know what people see in this. I always think of the Sound of Music. Hills Are Alive for some reason. But these are the silly tests that we use as neuroscientists for creative cognition. And we're kind of, as you can see, trying to get at that concept of creativity, but it's not synonymous with creativity. It's little bits and pieces of creative cognition. It's not creativity per se. Now this is my brain, first of all, to prove that I do have a brain in my head, but also to demonstrate the concept of cortical thickness. This is one of the methods that we use where we can take the brain out of the skull and we can measure the thickness of the neurons on the surface of the brain, And the nerve cell bodies are right on the surface of the brain, and they differ in volume from about 2 millimeters to up to 6, 7, 8 millimeters. And that cortical thickness varies from different regions of the brain and from person to person. And we can measure the cortical mantle, or the processing modes, if you think of your computer, of the processor right on the surface of the brain. And as Bob was saying in his talk, when you use your brain in a concerted way, the growth mindset, let's say, you're building up your brain in certain regions like a muscle. And you can measure that thickening of different regions of the brain with our MRI technology. So one of the questions that we asked when we were looking at our creativity studies is, where in the brain is creativity, our measures of creativity, correlated with cortical thickness in the brain, throughout the whole brain? We didn't have any hypotheses per se. We were talking about this last night. It was kind of a fishing expedition. One of the reasons we have to do fishing expeditions because no one's ever done research on this before. We can't formulate hypotheses when no one has done research before in this area. So we constrained our research to the entire brain, asking the question, where is cortical thickness correlated with creativity? And what we found was really surprising. There was one particular region of the brain where we found cortical thickness was correlated with creative achievement. So this is not these measures of divergent thinking, but what people had done, these are college students, what college students had done out in the world, whether they'd published a poem, whether they'd were dancing in a dance group, whether they were doing culinary arts. There's 11 different categories. Scientific, did they hold a patent? And this one region was in the frontal lobe, so this is an expanded brain view, and this is the temporal lobe, this is the frontal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and you can see I've got this thought control device around the frontal lobe, that there's a region in the very front of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, and it's blue for a very specific reason, because it's not cortical thickness, it's thinning that was correlated with creative achievement. Thinner cortex was correlated with creativity. How can that be? This is confusing, because bigger, better, stronger, faster won the day with intelligence research previously. Thickening, better white matter, more biochemistry, higher intelligence in our previous research. With creativity, though, the story was different. It was a disinhibitory model. It was as if the brain was releasing the brakes on the system in such a way to allow ideas to bump into each other more readily. And this is how we interpreted it, that this was a frontal disinhibitory model. So you think about Beethoven's Long Walk, you think about the meditation, you think about waking up from a dream state, or the warm shower, or even drinking. It's a disinhibitory model. You're putting the error checkers, you're taking off the brake from the, and letting off the, you're taking off the brake and perhaps pushing on the accelerator a bit in terms of the brain networks that are involved. Very fascinating. Another technique we use is diffusion tensor imaging. This allows us to look at the white matter of the brain. The white matter is the wires that connect up the different processing modules of the brain. Again, this is my brain, white matter going right through the corpus callosum, and I'm going to articulate a little section and show you the connectivity of different regions of my brain. So this is the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres, and it kind of looks like I have a mohawk, but it's showing the white matter connectivity, more local connectivity, and then you can see, extending to broader regions as I move this seed around. But we can look at the pipes that connect the different regions of the brain and look at the fidelity or the strength of those connections. Just like that blue wire that connects your computer to the internet, it makes your brain infinitely more powerful to be able to connect up these modules to different regions and and pull those processors together. And so this story is similar to the previous one. We found a particular region in the white matter where lower white matter fidelity was correlated with higher creative ability. Again, and it was in the frontal lobe of the brain where you see, again, this is an axial view, so it's slicing through the brain, looking down on it from top to bottom. So now these are the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital lobe back here. And there's a region in the left frontal lobe, and I realize that this is the right side, but it's radiological convention. So this is left, believe me, and there's a region in the left frontal lobe where lower white matter fidelity was correlated with higher creative capacity in a different method. We did a meta-analysis or a review of other people who is doing research outside of our laboratory to look at all the structural data across studies. And this was published, last year in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. So these are lesion studies. Some of them are patients that have had damage to their brain, and they administered creativity studies to them. Other people using diffusion tensor imaging or using structural imaging techniques. All the regions that are blue are regions in the brain where lower fidelity measures or lesions or some sort of damage, if you will, to the brain, in some cases, was associated with higher creative capacity. All the regions in red are where higher brain fidelity was associated with higher brain capacity. And the results are striking. I mean, the predominance of blue regions, and again, this is not just our lab, but this is across multiple labs. The predominance of blue regions is striking. And the location of the blue versus the red regions is striking because, again, there's these two different networks of the brain. So one of the networks where you saw the red region it's called the cognitive control network. It is basically the intelligence network of the brain. It's this reasoning, rational, cognitive control, dealing with problems in the external world. And we've written at length on this cognitive control network. It's mostly on the outside rind of the brain, it's called dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and lateral portions of the parietal lobe. But this outside portion of the brain is the external thought network. It's a special purpose improvisation or rule-based cognitive system. It's deductive reasoning, cognition in the external world. When you're solving problems out there and thinking of things out there, this cognitive control network, executive control network, attention network, these are synonyms for this type of network, is engaged. Those are the regions generally where you saw those red associations between creativity and brain fidelity. In contrast, the regions where you saw the blue is this internal thought network. And another hot topic in the cognitive neurosciences is the default mode network, which you might have heard about. This is a network that gets engaged when you're thinking internally, when you're thinking about yourself, when you're thinking about your relationships, when you're thinking about mental simulation of how you might deal with a problem before you actually implement that. This is that visualization that Bob was talking about that you want to induce kids to do before they solve a problem out in the world. That first step is visualization. You want to get kids and people in general to visualize how they might solve a problem. This is the default mode network. And there's a high correlation between these regions that are downregulated in our study, or in our hands, and in other researchers' hands, and this internal thought network that I think is involved in situation-specific improvisation, inductive and abductive reasoning as opposed to deductive, mental simulation. This preparation and incubation part is critically involved with this. So this is the Hunt-Lenox globe. This is the oldest globe that we have from the 1510s that shows the world. It's copper. It's made of copper, and it's in the New York Public Library. I'd like to go visit it someday. Right there on the globe it says "Hic sunt dracones." Here are dragons. That's where this comes from, is this globe, and you can see, I mean, there's India up here, and on the other side there's Africa, Europe up here, but this is the globe where that "here are dragons" comes from, if you're interested. And there's only two versions of a globe where you see "here are dragons" in the world. So I wrote this article, Evolution, Creativity, Intelligence, and Madness, Here Be Dragons, because we are out on the fringes of reality. We're out on the fringes of thought, trying to put these ideas together. Are there two networks in the brain? A creative network in the brain, an intelligence network in the brain. We customarily call it intelligence and creativity. Is there a novel problem-solving module in the brain and a useful problem-solving in the brain? Is one characterized by deductive reasoning and one by abductive reasoning? Divergent thinking versus convergent thinking. Is neural disinhibition involved in one versus neural fidelity involved in another? That's what we appear to be seeing. They overlap, and they're both critically important to reasoning processes out in the world. You have to have both of these to be successful as a human being, as a young child, as a developing individual. But I think this is really important in terms of reasoning capacity, in terms of understanding creative capacity, and in terms of perhaps understanding psychopathology, because at the extremes of creativity, you often see at the way extremes, there's hypotheses that psychosis is at the far extreme of creative capacity, where all my ideas are good, everything's related to me, all things are related to each other. This is an overexpression of this linkage thing that our brain does. And at the extreme of intelligence network is autism, where there's this rule-based rigidity of ideas. And these are the extreme manifestations of the thing that the brain is shooting for in terms of evolutionary capacity, and we happen to call psychopathology. So I think this is an interesting idea that I'm playing with currently. Now, to wrap up the growth mindset, I think these two brain networks are critically important, and I think we need to focus on both of them when we're talking about the growth mindset. Now, Dweck focused on intelligence, but I think we need to focus on creativity as well. Internal and external thought networks can be developed. And I think while Dweck, I believe, focused on intelligence, I think we also need to focus on this internal mindset, visualization of ideas before implementing it out in the world. And I think that's underappreciated, the fact that it might be helpful for children to stop, wait, think, cogitate, before putting an idea out. And if we can facilitate that and reward thinking in that mode, I think that might be a good muscle to develop in the brain. Dedication and hard work matter to both internal and external networks. You have to build that muscle over time. Kids know how to work in that preparation phase, and with these devices that we have, constantly acquiring information is the order of the day. There has to be quiet time in order to develop that muscle of the internal thought network, to be able to build that ability as well. And if you can't shut off and detach from that, that muscle will atrophy and die. You can impact future abilities in both internal and external networks of the brain. And I think that's where you come in to be able to facilitate from Dweck's research and the research that Bob reviewed, you can influence both these brain networks. I think the focus is certainly on the external manifestation of these networks, but I think we are underappreciating the internal network that we have to grow and facilitate to get there. Finally, I came across this quote from Martin Schwartz, who's a researcher, and talked about the importance of stupidity in scientific research. I have to tell you, I feel stupid every day I wake up and I come across a problem, and he's giving us permission to admit this, and perhaps stupid is the wrong word, but humble is really important. Science, and I would argue life, involves confronting our absolute stupidity. That kind of stupidity is an existential fact, inherent in our efforts to push our way into the unknown. That couldn't be more true. We have to confront the fact that there are things we don't know and we can't fake it. And to teach people that reality, I think, is critically important. Productive stupidity means being ignorant by choice, going to work and saying, I do not know what I'm going to do today, but I'm going to explore and try to figure it out. Focusing on important questions puts us in the awkward position of being ignorant. One of the beautiful things about science, and I would argue life, is that it allows us to bumble along, getting it wrong time after time, and feel perfectly fine as long as we learn something each time. I think this is involved in the growth mindset. Finally, the more comfortable we become with being stupid, the deeper we will wade into the unknown, and the more likely we are to make big discoveries. I think that is beautiful wisdom from this researcher. Thank you for your attention.